All right, so let's get started. I would like to welcome everyone to Trust in Local Journalism in Atlanta panel and discussion. This event is brought to you by PEN America, along with our media sponsor and event co-sponsor, Free Press. As I said before, my name is William Johnson, and I'm the program director for PEN Across America. Now, PEN is an organization that champions the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. But within the larger organization of PEN America, the PEN Across America program provides resources to mobilize PEN America communities across the country. In 2019, PEN announced 6 new chapters, PEN America chapters, in Tulsa, Birmingham, Detroit, Dallas, Fort Worth, Austin, and the Piedmont region of North Carolina. And recently, this year, we opened a chapter in Miami, South Florida. Our PEN America chapters are doing fantastic work, including organizing public forums, highlighting the work of local journalists in the time of COVID, and hosting literary conversations and events just like this one. To learn about more about what we're doing, please visit pen.org or sign up to become a member. And I'm going to actually put that in the chat. Hold on one second. Let me just get the link for you. Here's a link to find out more about PEN and actually to become a member, because our strength is actually in our membership. We believe that everyone has a unique part to play in the defense of free expression, the celebration of literary excellence, and amplifying marginalized voices. So please think about joining PEN and supporting our work. And with that, I am actually going to turn it over to our moderator. Sheena Roadman is a located journalist living in Atlanta, Georgia. She holds a BA in journalism from Georgia State University with an English major minor and a research specialty in American Indian media and advocacy journalism. She worked at the Atlanta Press Club as a director of membership and programs, as well as continuing to work as a freelance journalist with bylines in the New York Times, Women's Day, House Beautiful, and others. So Sheena, I am going to pass the mic over to you.
Thank you, and thank you again for inviting me. I said this earlier when we were on Behind the Curtain, but I'm very flattered to be here, especially with these other panelists. So I'm just gonna go ahead and jump in. First, we have Willoughby Mariano. She's an investigative reporter at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, where she focuses on housing and criminal justice issues. Sonam Vashi is co-founder and operations director of Canopy Atlanta, which is a community-led nonprofit newsroom. She's covered criminal justice, immigration, and the South, and has appeared in the New York Times, Atlanta Magazine, ProPublica, and others. And finally, Janice Ware is the publisher of The Atlanta Voice and has served the citizens of metropolitan Atlanta for more than 40 years. She focuses on low and moderate income housing and community economic development. And with that, I'm just going to go ahead and jump in if that's okay with everyone. Again, thank you for having me tonight. Local journalism is something that's very near and dear to my heart. Before I joined the Atlanta Press Club, I solely worked as a freelance reporter and mostly covered Native American topics. I myself am Lakota, and seeing stories covered from that community covered by a Native American journalist, seeing how important that was to the community really kind of lit a fire for local journalism. So today, of course, we're not talking about Native American issues, but we are talking about Atlanta, and we've got some fantastic local journalists here in Atlanta to talk about this all with. So my first question, Janice, I hope it's okay. I'm going to start with you. We talk a lot about how a free press is vital to democracy, but how does a free local press help protect local communities? And why is access to local news so important, not just to democracy, but to our community?
So I think that first of all, let me step back and say thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be one of the oldest panelists, or the oldest panelist on this group, but I appreciate being invited. local journalism is really key and critical to communities of color and other ethnic organizations or nationalities. Because the fact is, if you don't have people who look like you and have walked in your shoes to be able to cover the news and information in a manner and in a format that relates to your community, you're not really getting the full picture. So you tell the story from your vantage point. And a lot of times I believe that national news coverage covers the topics, but it doesn't tell how that topic affects the individuals personally and in those communities. So I think it's critical. It is an insurance policy to make certain that everybody understands what is going on, how it is going to affect you, and what things we need to do to circumvent or to promote those actions being taken.
Absolutely. And it's Sonam and Willoughby, feel free to jump in if you have any thoughts as well.
Well, let me dive in then from a legacy newspaper, Metro newspaper perspective. I don't speak for the AJC, but what I can say is that, as there was a PEN America report said this, a couple of years ago, that we are sort of the keystone species. The daily local newspaper is a kind of keystone species in this news ecosystem, and it's where a lot of stories often sort of end up bubbling up to national attention, and also, it wields a kind of influence that on a local and statewide level that not a lot of other news outlets have been able to do. And we also have just so many people, even now, relative to, in our diminished capacity, after, newsrooms have been cut drastically, we are still the largest game in town. There are so many of us, and we are the ones who often find out about very important things. And so, we're a way to connect people with information about their government, about their neighborhoods, that will help them make important civic decisions, whether it be, voting, supporting certain issues or candidates. We're just an essential function to civic life.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, there are just so many things, as journalists, we're always writing across some type of difference, whether it's, demographic or just lived experience. Even if I'm covering someone from my community, my lived experience may not be the same, but what we can share is like a sense of community. And I just don't think that that's something you can get unless you live in a community, unless you take part in it, unless you're, as Willoughby and Janice were saying, as part of the civic process. And that's what journalists do. And in the best case scenario, we, promote not only civic connection, but just connection to one another. And, at Canopy, our entire mission is about making the journalistic process, journalism in every single community in Atlanta, more collaborative. So we pair experienced journalists and community residents together to choose stories, to report them, and to present them in their communities. And what we're finding through this, some people call it like hyper-local process, we're focusing on specific neighborhoods, specific information systems. What we're finding is that people feel more connected to their communities that way. And I think that's just something you can't replicate, from a top-down national way.
So that actually kind of leads me into the next question regarding community trust, and how do we as journalists establish trust in our work? And Sonam, I actually wanted to ask you this question because of your work with Canopy, and I know that that's a big part of what you guys do is kind of pairing established journalists with community members and having them work together on storytelling. So if you want to talk a little bit about that thought process with Canopy and how you are still, because I know you guys are working on issue 2 right now.
Yeah, so we did our first issue in West End, and now we're working in Forest Park, which are 2 very different communities, but are all still part of Metro Atlanta. And
I was born in Forest Park, so.
Were you? I didn't know that.
Yep.
That's awesome.
Yep.
We should be talking to you.
No. I've been a long time Decatur resident now, so I don't think I count anymore. But yeah, no, I loved that Forest Park choice. So yeah, anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I think for us, you know, I mean, I think we've been talking as a society, maybe largely about trust in journalism in the last few years, particularly as disinformation and misinformation have become so prevalent. But you know, for a lot of communities, including my own growing up, like we never trusted the news because we never saw ourselves in it. And that doesn't mean that, you know, we think it's false or fake, but I think that I think trust and building trust with communities does end up, you know, necessitating to take a look at like what past harms have been created. You know, in West End, for our first issue, we asked questions to more than 50, 60 West End residents. You know, how do you feel like your community has been portrayed in any media or mainstream media? And over again, all we heard were about deficit-related reporting. You know, cameras only come when there's a crime that happens, right? And there was no focus on the sort of unique. And you know, I know Janice has been doing this work for so long, and like, there was no focus on the unique cultural assets that were there, or even just talking about whatever types of issues were happening in a way that took a look at the types of things that were happening. And so, you know, I think from a trust perspective, what we've found is that, you know, I was just talking about how my favorite part of a journalist is that sort of connection that you have when you talk to someone, anyone, like whether it's, particularly when it's someone who's never talked to a reporter before, but people who are involved in civic life and often trying to make it better. And like, why would we try to hoard that experience? You know, like, why would we not try to make that experience as accessible as possible? And so what we're doing is we're trying to bring in as many residents as we can, as many community members from overlooked communities, overlooked and historically excluded by mainstream media, and usually by white legacy media, into every part of the process. And that in and of itself engenders trust. You know, I think we think, you know, I have such an appreciation for what journalists do, and journalists particularly who are more experienced than I am. But the tools that we use to report, in most cases, are not that complicated. We are talking to people, we are asking questions, we are trying to write things in a way that is accessible. And these tools should be shared with as many people as possible. And I think that's what kind of establishes community trust from our perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Janice Willoughby, do you have anything? Yeah.
So the Atlanta Voice was actually founded by my late father in 1966. And it was formed with a motto that said, a people without a voice cannot be heard. And the fact is, we were able to, or they were able to at that point, to be able to capture stories about race relations, segregation, integration, anything that was related to the community at that time. And police brutality that they talk so much about today existed at that same period. So nothing is really new. It's just how you deliver that information and how people feel comfortable in receiving it. And understanding that there has to be some compassion to the story, and that there are always two sides of every story, not a right and a wrong, but the other side of the story and how it affects our people. And I think it is important that people feel comfortable having those conversations because they're critical. And it's important that we talk to and not talk at people. And if we don't talk to and actually engage them in a conversation, then you're still telling only one side of the story. So we're proud of our history. We're proud of our legacy. We want to continue to be a voice of the community. We want to continue to tell those stories that other people will overlook because in their minds it may be too small, or that the majority of the metropolitan Atlanta area may not be interested in the story. So West End is an area that we spent a lot of time in because that was where the shopping mall was and the A&P grocery store. So I can relate because as a native Atlantan, I cannot call myself a Grady baby because I was born at East Spalding Hospital, but I am, since they took over that hospital, I can actually claim it at that point. So I just think we just need to really focus on what people want to hear about, and that's just going to be an important part of our future and our legacy.
Absolutely. I like how you said there's two sides to every story, not necessarily right and wrong, but just two sides. I really like that.
And I think people want to make it a right and wrong matter, and it's not a right and wrong. it's from your vantage point, how do you see it? So there was a movie, I think years ago, maybe 10 years ago, they called Vantage Point, and I couldn't understand it at the time. It kept showing the same scene over and over again, but it always did it from a different angle. So if you ever see that movie, you will see it because everybody had a different point of view because that's the view or the lens that they were looking through. So I think it's important for us to realize that there are other sides.
Philippi, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, well, I love this trust conversation because it's such a complicated issue. And of course, I'm speaking for what I think is fair to call sort of the historically white paper, because of, we were deeply involved in segregation and in some way kind of manufactured Atlanta's particular kind of segregation. And we, so the issue of trust has been so complicated over so many years. And although I think in general, though, local news sources, whichever community they reflect, tend to be trusted, in surveys, you can look this up, tend to be trusted far more than other, national publications. And I think the power of that is that we can talk through disinformation, misinformation, and help overcome it in ways that news organizations that focus mostly on the sort of national partisan lines do not, and almost seem unable to do in recent years. Our interest group is regional. If we're doing our jobs right, we are speaking to our neighbors, and we have a commonality there that we can, a community that we're part of, that we can help build bridges in because of our local knowledge and authority.
Yeah, we're part of the community that we're reporting on. So yeah, no, I completely agree. I just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box below. So as we're talking about trusting community, it also kind of makes me think about this thing we all love called citizen journalism, where you have, just someone out there reporting on the street, and maybe they have a blog or something. But how do we feel about that? I'm really just asking almost out of my own personal curiosity. Maybe they didn't go to J school, they don't have professional training as a journalist. And again, this is where I really love what Canopy's doing, because I feel like you're kind of creating a situation that can foster that interest in reporting. But I don't know, just something to think about. Anyone have any thoughts?
So I would tell you that I support it because I think that there are conversations that are being had in communities that we don't know anything about. So if you don't hear from, again, that vantage point or that person's perspective, you're going to miss something that's out there. So while I would not ever consider them journalists, I would consider them spokespeople or a person, but not necessarily a journalist, because that is a craft and that is an art, and we have to respect it as such. But to take that story and elevate it to a different level might be something that we could really kind of wrap our arms around.
I like that. I know when I was reporting a lot more than I do now, I'd get a lot of story ideas just from people maybe gossiping on Facebook or on Reddit or something. And they're like, oh, yeah, my son was robbed at Wendy's or wherever it is. And I'd look into it and it turned into a story because it was racial profiling. So I have to at least give props where they're due for giving me story ideas, if nothing else. Absolutely.
This is kind of, my own perspective and that of, some of Canopy's co-founders, but one thing I've always really liked about journalism is that, J schools and professionalizing of this profession, is somewhat of a recent phenomenon, if you go back prior to like the 1960s, you know, that wasn't quite as there. And you know, in its foundation, you don't need to pass a bar exam to be a journalist. You don't need a medical license. There's not, you don't have to spend, you know, half of your year and a lot of money to go to school necessarily, in theory, although I think, you know, those of us who have worked professionally can tell you that J school is becoming more and more of a, and the people who can afford to go there are becoming more and more of a prerequisite. And so, and you know, this is kind of informed by my own experience as a freelance journalist too, where sometimes I'll be going to press conferences or just reporting out. You know, I was doing this during the protests last year. And I don't really have an assignment, but I'm kind of like doing reporting, maybe for a story that I might pitch. But I'm kind of just there, you know what I mean? Like, and I think for me and for many of us, the sort of distinction between like citizen journalist and journalist seems to me a bit of a fabrication. It's, you know, there are plenty of journalists, including in the city, that I would not trust. I'm sure that there are plenty on that list for all of you. I'll be for the post-Zoom
We'll have to get your names after we're not live anymore.
Well, but you know, I think there have been plenty of situations in which like small and large organizations in the city have gotten it wrong. I mean, you know, I saw in the Q&A, someone was talking about how CNN recently described Buckhead as a suburb of Atlanta. That was making the rounds today on social media. You know, it's a really small thing, but it is like a good example of like, you know, people getting it wrong. And so for me, I mean, I think it is, I think what we're trying to do is to put people in one camp, which is people who want better access to information for their community and are publishing that information in a way that is accessible. You know, we like to pretend that we are people who are objective and have no sort of like lived experience that would ever inform, you know, the way that we think about a story. And yet, of course, that we know that that's the case. We know that, you know, I think that like the historic Black press is such a great example of people, of an entire generation of journalists who reported on the civil rights movement that the white press was just ignoring for decades, you know? And so we know that journalists are fallible. And I think to kind of create this other category of citizen journalists is to me like not correct, especially as this industry is changing so quickly. And so I think that what we should be doing is trying to join forces with these citizen journalists who often, frankly, are better plugged into their information systems of their communities better than we are. You know, they know who the person on the block is who everyone else gets their information from. Usually, you know, someone who's been there for years. They know the barbershop where people are always exchanging information. They know which community billboard is actually like getting looked at and where people get jobs from. These are very valuable places to get information, especially for people who don't necessarily have great internet access or who have, or who are just not getting information in their community through, you know, social media. So that's my 2 cents on that.
So growing up in Atlanta, I will tell you that we had a term for that, and it was called the street committee. And the street committee knew everything that was going on. So you may not have all the facts correct, but there were some facts in there that were certainly critical components of that story. So I can relate to that.
I love that. I love that. I think you brought up something that I kind of want to get into. We could talk about this for days, but you mentioned J school being often inaccessible for a lot of people. We're all women here. We're all minorities. I know when I was in J school, I was not able to do an internship because they couldn't afford it. What do you guys think about, there's been a lot of efforts lately to diversify, you know, get Native American journalists or Black journalists in newsrooms. But there's this big push, but I don't see a lot of money behind it. What do you guys think about that?
I am a child of affirmative action in newspapers. If it wasn't for a few very diversity, people whose job it was, recruiters. Once upon a time, when this industry actually had jobs, there were recruiters who would go to every single, who would create job fairs and actually meet people of color and drag them into the industry, kicking and screaming, or help them, for instance, find a paid internship with a good living wage that would make, entering this industry and getting the credentialing you need possible. I started off in this industry in a venerable affirmative action program called METPRO, which was run by the Los Angeles Times. And the funny thing about it was that, yes, many of our candidates came from working class backgrounds with the sorts of absence of privilege that you would often see in communities of color, because we in general do not have access to resources. But half our class went to Ivy League schools. We were the ones that needed credentialing through a special affirmative action program to be considered as equals to other people in the newsroom. And you would look at our credentials and think, well, what's going on here? There's, for a long time, what I'm trying to say is that for a long time, this industry has tried to bring in people of color, give them jobs every now and then, in a way to say, hey, look, we have this great diverse newsroom. But
the assignments were not great.
Yeah, the assignments were horrible. They were often, we were sort of put in the more dangerous positions. We were given far lower pay. In fact, METPROs were found to have far lower pay even in recent years, according to recent news coverage. And the ideas didn't change. Just because somebody has a dark face does not mean that they are going to be doing something for diversity in your newsroom. It's not like you can magically have a person of color sit in a seat and redeem, years of very ugly racial history. Bing, we're not Tinkerbell, in other words. And so what ideas need to change from the top. People of color actually need power, and they need to be believed. That is the big problem with in newsrooms still today. They do not believe they're people of color, and they do not let us have positions of power. And that's a horrible, and that's a horrible way to lose trust in a community, because again, we are the ones, the local news outlets are the ones that have the opportunity to build these bridges, to help, to create that connectedness that makes a community a community. And yet still we're making the same mistakes we did, 20 years ago when I got in this business, and many, many, many years before that.
Yeah. Well said.
Very well said. Well said.
I could talk about this for years.
I could too. I feel like I maybe shouldn't have mentioned it, because I think we need to get back on track here. But yeah, I could talk about lack of paid internships, and something you said really resonated with me, of the stories that you're assigned as that person in a newsroom. You either aren't allowed to cover those stories of your own community because you'll be too biased, or you're only given those stories, and yeah, it's exhausting to be that, but the token.
I think it's disappointing, and it just not encourage people to want to go into this industry, which is unfortunate, because I think we have excellent writers in the community. We have excellent stories to tell, but if you don't give us the opportunity, they don't exist. So while I was not at the paper, at the Atlanta Voice at that time, I remember, during the civil rights movement, a lot of the reporters that were African-American were actually recruited to the AJC, or the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at that point, so that they could get into the community to get the stories. And then it became a whole different scenario, that people wanted or felt that if the story was not in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that it didn't have the same degree or the same merit. And I think that is what is a problem with journalism today sometimes. We need to realize the stories are out there, and we need to be able to let those stories resonate to the top so that people can actually hear them and accept them and understand them. So I agree.
Absolutely. What are some things that you as a reporter do, or I'm sorry, what are some of the challenges you face when you're doing these hyper-local, community-oriented stories? And again, in Atlanta, we know that usually comes down to minorities. So what are the challenges you face?
So you've got to really be able to get into that community and get so deeply entrenched in that community that you can find people who are going to be willing to talk to you honestly and openly, because they may know the answers to your question, but if they don't trust you, they're not going to share the information. It's going to be bits and pieces. So in going to anybody's community, we go back into our own community and ask the story, you're more likely to get the real story, the true story, the undercurrents that people try to brush over because you don't want to be perceived as being racist or biased or different. You tell that story differently. So I think that it's going to be important that we figure out a way that people can get in and that they can relate to the reporter, they can relate to the community and not come in and stand in judgment of what they see. Because some circumstances that people are having to deal with are for no fault of that person at all. You know, it's the situations they were born into. It was the redlining that took place in housing and with insurance costs and not being able to get mortgages in that community. And, you know, West End Atlanta is one of those neighborhoods that they can talk about that a lot. And, you know, how long does it take for people to realize that housing is housing, affordable housing is real, and we need to focus on what that really means. But if you have a house in West End and then you have a house in, let's say, Midtown or Buckhead, and the insurance rates are more expensive than West End, it doesn't make sense. It just doesn't. But that's the fact. Insurance rate and taxes are even more, you know, are higher. So how do you do that? So how can a person get ahead if those stories are not being told or talked about?
Yeah, I would co-sign everything Janice says, and generally and for this, but also, you know, I think the challenge is time. You know, you have to put time and intentionality in any sort of community-centered reporting that you do. And so, you know, our entire model is we listen, we spend weeks, if not months, doing like front end, you know, community engagement, but really it's like just community listening. And our, you know, director, Marianne Martin, is a genius with this kind of stuff. But like, you know, we're canvassing, we're doing cold calling. We just to kind of understand like what are the information needs in the specific community. And that takes resources, that takes planning, you know, I mean, that is not something that I would have been able to do outside of this particular model. And so, you know, what we are also understanding too is that like journalism is often extractive. You know, when we go inside these communities, regardless of whether they're our own or not, in some cases, I mean, I've done this before, you know, I'm taking a story and then someone is giving me their time and vulnerability, and I'm taking that and saying, thanks, bye. You know, like, I mean, obviously you know, you write the story, if you have, you know, the time and incentive, you talk about the story after it's published with the source and give them time and opportunity to ask questions or give you comments. But even that process feels extractive. And so what we're understanding now is that it really needs to be a generative relationship. When we understand what information needs are, we really need to fill them. And so, you know, going back to this conversation even about like the kind of access and accessibility of being a journalist in the first place, now we have a cost problem, right? So we're writing these stories that are often, I mean, these are the stories that I love, right? They're long form, they're they're kind of like big picture about like human vulnerability and all these things, when in reality, you know, I think as Janice was just talking about, people just need like very specific information. How do I fix this? How do I turn on my utilities? How do I dispute my water bill? How do I get food tomorrow? You know, and that doesn't mean that you can't have beautiful stories and fulfill those information needs together, which is I think what we're trying to do. But we're finding out that in order for reporting not to be extractive, you really have to do a good job of filling those really basic information needs. You know, like why is my insurance more expensive here versus elsewhere? And giving them information that directly improves their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have anything to add, Willoughby?
No, I really do agree about time being the big hurdle nowadays. And also, I mean, in Atlanta, the AJC has been sort of this juggernaut for, you know, well over a century. But we are much smaller than we used to be because the business model has changed. It is very difficult to make money off of digital advertising. And we no longer have money from classified ads, and yet we're still read by so many people, millions and millions of people. And so there are fewer of us and we have less time. You don't see us at your, you know, your school board meeting. We literally don't have enough bodies to attend. And so the trust that we used to be able to create by just simply being there that can no longer happen. You know, certainly not at the level that it used to. So I'm really grateful that as local news and sort of the model for what is a good, healthy local news system, you know, shifts and adapts, that you know, groups like Canopy exist to fill the gaps that we can no longer fill, and that the Atlanta Voice is there to address issues that the AJC cannot get to for now because we are worried about a huge, you know, crisis somewhere else, or some other issues are taking up our time.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting to see over the past maybe decade, as legacy media is figuring all this out, you've seen groups like Canopy or like the Clayton Crescent or Decatur-ish pop up and really, you know, start to get these really hyper localized stories. So it's been really interesting to see. And I'll be honest, I want to like throw money at everyone. So it's kind of hard for my bank account right now because I'm like donating here, but it's a good thing to support. I want to go ahead and introduce our local PEN America representative, Nora Benavides. She's going to come on for a few minutes and talk about some legislation that relates to all of this. Hi, Nora.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to be here with all of you. I've been listening the whole time, but and I was I was jotting down quotes, Janice referring to the insurance policy that local news provides. I have too many that I was writing down. It's been a wonderful discussion. But I'm here this evening to talk a little bit about ways that we can all be involved in supporting robust local journalism. I lived and worked in Atlanta for many years. So hearing some of the local ways that I think Atlanta's news ecosystem has failed communities, and specifically communities of color, over generations, it's not new to me, and I don't think it's new to probably the people who are attending, or at least I hope not. So it's been just wonderful to listen to you guys talk about and sort of frame this. And I think a question that comes up often is, well, what can we do? You know, aside from the meaningful accountability journalism that we see in this panel, the kinds of long form and historical views, as Willoughby is describing this trajectory of over the last several decades. I think there's just this very real question of what are we losing when we don't have journalism, and how can we build it back up? And what we have found at PEN America over the last several years is there is such a clear link between local journalism and democracy. that we have to make it, and we have to be vehemently, I think, dogged in this. We have to make this a nonpartisan issue. We're so at risk now. I think we're teetering on the edge as mis and disinformation are considered rampant in our information ecosystems. We're really dangerously close to something like local journalism being somehow a partisan issue. And yet when we do not have local journalism in our communities, there are a number of things that happen. One is people are less likely to know when local elections happen. They are less likely to vote. Corporate malfeasance goes up. Government salaries at the local level rise because there's really little accountability or investigation into what's happening. And I know over many years in Atlanta when organizers would say, this is a story that has to be told, and there was simply not enough bandwidth for it to be told, all of the communities and the impact over generations and over days or months, those hyper immediate and those long-term impacts suffer. And they're in the middle of all of this. I think what we find is that just sort of a recurring theme that when there is robust local journalism, there is really a better connection that communities have to everything that is happening in society, both at the local and the national level. And so I just want to give you guys a taste of what we're doing, because I feel this link more than ever. And that when we do not have local news, when people in our communities are not engaged or aware of why it matters, it really kind of flounders. And I think that what we need is to reinvigorate that local news as a concept is something that's vital to how we connect with each other. And so what we are doing is, of course, these conversations. We are hoping to spark interest from people that might otherwise not have known Janice or her father and the long link and accountability that they have done in Atlanta. I won't, for time, I'm not going to go through everyone, but this is part of our hope, is just to spark interest. And then there is the interest in trying to invigorate people to get involved and make your voices heard. I am a civil rights lawyer. I so often feel like when we don't feel our voices matter, our voices don't matter. And so I am here, in my small 5-minute plug to say all of our voices matter. And so PEN America is working on a piece of legislation that we have endorsed that I would love to share more with all of you. And I hope that at some point you might try to learn more about it, maybe even become a member of PEN and figure out if you feel you can endorse it. To give you a brief teaser, we have been working with Senators Brian Schatz of Hawaii, Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, Michael Bennet of Colorado, and Representatives Mark Vesey from Texas and Brian Fitzpatrick from Pennsylvania to create a kind of bipartisan consensus building committee within Congress that could help identify ways to reinvigorate and revitalize pathways to support local journalism. So that's really, like, in short, how can we fund and find financial pathways to fund local journalism? And through that committee, we are hoping that we can also kind of minimize the notion that this is partisan, that we can increase people's awareness that this is a key pillar of democracy. And so this is called the Future of Local News Act. I'll share in the chat how you can get involved. I think I am dangerously over my time, but I really do mean it when I say we're in contact with these members of Congress every week. We hear that when you write to them, it actually makes a difference. And I don't think that we talk enough about what that real link is when community members speak out, when they say, hey, I just learned about the connection between local journalism and democracy, or local journalism and this issue in my community, the Beltline. Pick any recent controversy that we've seen, local elections. And so I hope that you'll learn more. I'll continue to put some of the links in the chat. I know William's been dropping some in, but we are so thrilled to have had all of you. I hope I didn't take too much time, Sheena.
No, you're perfect. Absolutely perfect. I took too much.
Fired up, and
yeah. Well, on that note, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. We've got one really good question from Susanna Capilouto. Hi, Susanna. She's one of our board members at the Atlanta Press Club. And congratulations on all of WABE's awards that you won today as well, Susanna. She says, engagement journalism is quickly becoming a tool to get diverse voices into reporting, but I'm not seeing it being fully embraced yet by traditional media, as it takes effort and a lot more commitment. Why do you think it's slow to take hold? Anyone?
I would probably say that it's the amount of time and the lack of resources and not having the funding to be able to support that. Because if you don't have, if you got, how many, you're down, whatever AJC is down to, because that was truly the elephant in the room, and they're not the elephant anymore, but you're not peanuts, but how can you send people to cover all of those things? It's a timing thing. We need to figure out a different way to have that conversation, and maybe Zoom is the way to do it. And now how do you notify people that that's the way you're going to communicate with them? I just think there are a lot of platforms that we have to be able to filter to pick the right one.
Yeah, I definitely see different, like Zoom is obviously the star of the year this past year, but I remember when I joined the press club 6 years ago, we were all scrambling to try and figure out how we could use Snapchat to talk about the press club. And now I don't know if people even use Snapchat anymore. Now it's TikTok. So, but I think part of it is definitely this technology is changing so quickly. And I'm not that old, but I'm old enough to know I can't keep up. So.
I kind of think it's, we've been talking a lot about information ecosystems today, and 20, 30 years ago, it was a lot, the information ecosystem was a lot more simple, right? So you'd have, like, we knew that if we published a story in the AJC, that it would be on people's doorsteps. Like, it was kind of like a pretty direct place to get information, or on the radio, like people are listening to the radio, they're always in their cars. We knew that there were places where people were going, and I think there, we could talk about how not every community was getting that information or participating in the ecosystem, but it was just a lot simpler. And I think as our ecosystems have changed, we haven't, like, now there's just so many different places to get information, and news organizations just generally haven't done a really good job of thinking about who they're trying to serve specifically, and B, figuring out the best ways to reach them. So for example, news, I think, generally, especially when we talk about like social media, when we talk about just things that like people have to pay for. I know paying for news and people supporting news is really important. Like, I think we all believe that, but also, we're talking about people who can afford to pay for news. We're not, that's always a problem when we're talking about paywalls and things like that. And so, what we've kind of discovered, and what we're learning from, there's so many amazing journalism startups and experiments going on from legacy publications as well across the country and world, is that there are so many low investment and high return ways to reach people depending on who you're trying to reach. So for example, if you're trying to reach people who live in apartment complexes along a particular boulevard, try direct mailers, try things that where people are going to get information a lot more easily, which may not look like something like a targeted Facebook ad necessarily, but it might actually be you going to those apartments and canvassing, or it might look like, if there's a bulletin board at that apartment complex. These are really like simple ways that it sounds like, but they're very, very effective is what we found. And it depends on the information ecosystem as well. West End has really active neighborhood Facebook groups. Forest Park does not. And so trying to leverage the types of things that are already going, there are already assets in these neighborhoods that are being used. And I just think that we're not using them very smartly as an industry generally. And I also think that, just as an addendum, journalists traditionally don't think that audience is part of their jobs. They think this is kind of just like a little tack on. We write the story, we post it, we move on to the next story. And then we don't really care if it actually reaches anyone we're trying to reach, And that's, I'm talking about myself in this situation. I'm talking about,
Done it.
Oh, totally. But like, I've for forever thought that audience is not my job. And now audience is the only thing I care about. It's like, why would you put any money into publishing something when it's not going to reach the people you actually are trying to reach? And we never define it generally anyway.
Yeah.
So that's my,
Something you said earlier about internet access. A lot of in my reporting on Native American communities on the reservations, you'd be shocked. People don't have internet. They don't have water. And Indian Country Today was the publication I used to report with. And for the longest time, up until I want to say maybe 2013 or 2014, they had a print magazine that went out every week. And they ended that for financial reasons, of course. But that was really disappointing, because for a lot of our elders, that was the only way they were getting views. They didn't have internet. They don't even have libraries, unless it's a 3-hour drive. So, Willoughby, did you have anything to add?
Gosh, this is such a complicated question. I think so I would say that it's very fair to fault the culture of mainstream local journalism, regional journalism, historically white, especially local journalism, for not or being anxious about this sort of kind of engagement, because it feels too activist-y to them. I mean, and I don't even know how well that anxiety could be articulated. I think there are a lot of good reasons to be very close to your audience and root for them. I mean, what's wrong with rooting for your, the well-being of your fellow neighbor, right? But and honestly, I mean, we used to be sitting on a money-making machine. So I mean, yeah, even till 2000, I mean, we were just just money everywhere. It was amazing what people were in large newsrooms were spending. I mean, we were sending people, giant teams to cover the Olympics overseas. Why? National news does that. So we didn't, there was lots of money being made and a lot of fear about us being seen as biased in some kind of way, and a lot of not understanding that this is where the news was going to go, and we've suffered for it.
Well, we're almost out of time. I don't see any more audience questions. Does anyone have any closing remarks or anything you want to end with?
I think this was an excellent conversation, and I really do appreciate being invited to participate. I've learned a lot, and I'm glad to have been a part of it.
I will echo that. I was very, very flattered to be asked to moderate, because all three of you are just incredible forces of nature to be reckoned with. So I'm flattered, and yeah, thanks. I see William just popped his head back up. So unless Sonam and Willoughby have anything else to add, I'll hand it over.
I would say thanks as well, and also that there's so many amazing journalists in Atlanta doing such amazing community-centered work. And my favorite thing about being a nonprofit with Canopy Atlanta is that we get to partner with all of these great journalists. And so, if you're a journalist on this call and want to partner with us, or if you work for another organization, we would love to figure out ways to partner with the AJC, which we've already done actually, and the Atlanta Voice, which we haven't done yet, but would love to.
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Let me unmute myself. Do the panelists want to drop any links in the chat that they would like the audience to see or read? Please, you can please do so now.
I can't drop a link in there, but I would encourage you to go and look at the homeless project, video project that we did for the Atlanta Voice. It's really quite interesting and powerful, because the fact is the city of Atlanta has not done a great job of dealing with the homeless population, but neither has the country as a whole, but we're trying to raise that awareness.
I'm going to drop a link. The Atlanta Press Club a couple years ago put together a little handbook called How Journalists and the Public Shape Our Democracy. And you can download, you can go to our website. I'm going to put the link in the chat. You can go to the website and download a PDF, or if you want, we can send you an actual printed book. It's completely free, but we put it together for the public, just to kind of do some media literacy work. So I thought that might be relevant to this conversation.
All right. Well, I just want to reiterate what Janice said in that I learned so much from this panel. I want to thank all the panelists and the moderator for such a dynamic conversation. I, I work at Penn, and my job, I'm really dedicated to Penn's mission. But it's panels like this that really kind of rejuvenate me, and our continued call to actions. These conversations really rejuvenate me and push me forward. So I want to thank all of you for your insight and your wisdom. If you want to receive more information about Penn, yet again, I'm going to put Penn's info in the chat. And if you're interested in membership, just follow this link. Yet again, thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. And, keep up the fight. And to the panelists, yet again, thank you for all the wonderful work you're doing to keep us all informed. So good night, everyone, and thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Good night.